Hello, everybody. Hopefully the audio is working this time. Here we are again, Dialectics Hour, doing Capital Volume 1, a slow reading of this text. I'm going to be doing this every Tuesday at 7 p.m., so be sure to tune in to the next episode. Hit the like and subscribe button if you want more. And there's also a Patreon where I'm going to be doing some bonus episodes where we could be going back over stuff and going into some detail on different parts of the text. But what I'm going to be doing, like I've been doing every week, although this time I've actually got my broadcasting software working and the sound on, is I'm going to be just showing the text on the screen. I'm going to be reading through it with everyone, and just kind of going through and explaining it really simply. Now I've read this text many times, of course, but I'm going to keep it kind of fresh, where I'm going to be reading it and rereading it with you on screen and thinking about it and kind of going through that process. So then hopefully this will help people not just learn what's going on in Capital, but learn some ways to read texts. It's something that I do with my students quite often as well. So let's jump right in. Well, let's see. Can make this a little bit better arranged. Oh, hold on. Sorry, just fixing this real quick. Okay. So here we are in section 2 of chapter 2 on the commodity. And so what we just talked about, just to give a review real quick, we talked about the commodity form, because the wealth of societies in the capitalist mode of production appears as an immense collection of commodities. What is a commodity? Put it very simply, a commodity is something that can be bought and sold. And it has two features to it. It's a use value, that is something that satisfies a human need, whether real or imagined. And it has an exchange value. And the exchange value is how much of one commodity I can trade for another commodity. Now, Marx argued that there must be some third thing that explains how commodities can be equal to each other, as what's being measured in each case by that exchange value. And he calls this third thing value. Value is not something that can be materially located or empirically found on the commodity, because it has to do with relations. And what determines the value of a commodity, Marx has argued, is the socially necessary labor time required to produce that commodity. So basically, what amount of labor time does it take society, taking the average unit of labor into account, to make that kind of thing? And then there's examples like diamonds. It takes a lot of time to find them, right? And so when you find them, all the time you spent looking is embodied in that diamond, and that's why diamonds are very valuable. And so that is the gist of what went on last time. Now, there was something very important as well, which is this idea that exchange value abstracts when things are placed in a relationship of exchange value, there's an abstraction that takes place. And this abstraction, what disappears in this abstraction is the very specific types of labor. So instead of a specific type of labor, what appears in the form of value that's expressed in exchange value is abstract labor, human labor in the abstract without regard to a specific kind. And so now in this section, we're going to look at that in closer detail. So this section is called the dual character of the commodity the dual character of the labor embodied in commodities. Okay. Let me silence notifications on my phone real quick. I'll make sure I can see the chat all right. Okay. Initially, the commodity appeared to us as an object with a dual character, possessing both use value and exchange value. So here, I've talked in the previous episode about how this word appearance, there's two different words that Marx uses for appearance, Schein and Erscheinung. And Erscheinung tends to be a kind of more grounded appearance, right? So there is something, and then that something appears in a certain way, and that announces that that thing is there. Whereas Schein has to do more with the appearance as an illusion. So things that are appearances really do appear, but they are manifestations of a deeper reality. Whereas things, when Marx uses the term Schein, he usually means that there's a false appearance. And so what Marx is saying here is that when we first looked at the commodity, it appeared to us as an object with a dual character, both a use value and exchange value. So that's kind of the first way we get a real look at the commodity. But then he says later on, it was seen that labor too has a dual character. Insofar as it finds its expression in value, it no longer possesses the same characteristics as when it is the creator of use values. Okay. So this is again summarizing what I just mentioned. So on the side of the commodity, things have that dual nature of use value, exchange value. Now Marx is saying if you look at the labor itself has a dual side that in a way corresponds to the dual side of the commodity. So insofar as labor finds its expression in value, that labor is what's expressed in the value of a commodity, it no longer possesses the same characteristics as when it is the creator of use values. And this has to do with the fact that the value of a commodity, what's embodied in the commodity, is human labor in the abstract. The socially necessary labor time required to make that commodity without any kind of, but just as pure labor, without any kind of specification of what kind of labor goes into it. Now, there is a whole problem here of taking skilled labor into account, and that's something that Marx is going to mention, but he's going to bracket off that question. But when we get to that, I'll say a little bit about how one could make that kind of calculation. But when labor creates a use value, it is specific. It is, I am, working as a blacksmith with my hammer making something, right? Or, I'm working in a factory making a specific type of commodity, like maybe making CDs or something, right? But that doesn't matter as far as the value expressed in the commodity is concerned, because this value is something that is an expression of concrete labor in the abstract. Marx then says, I was the first to point out and examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. And here the footnote is to, so it says, check the previous citation. I think that he's, critique of political economy, probably. I believe so. I've looked this up at one point. That's an annoying thing to do. Yeah, so critique of political contributions to the critique of political economy. And so Marx is seeing this distinction between concrete and abstract labor to be a unique contribution of his own take on classical economics to the political economy tradition. At this point, it is crucial to an understanding of political economy. As this point is crucial to an understanding of political economy, it requires further elucidation. Okay, so now let's get into the examples. Let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the value of the first be twice the value of the second, so that if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat equals 2W. Okay. So in this case, a coat would be worth 20 yards of linen. But here we're using the expression W, and W stands for 10 yards of linen. Coat, 2W, or 20 yards of linen. The coat is a use value that satisfies a particular need, right? Keeps you warm. A specific kind of productive activity is required to bring it into existence. So coat making, right? I'm not sure how coats are made today, but back in Marx's day, it was probably some kind of tailor of some kind. I'm sure there were coat factories, and there are coat factories today where these things are made. Is the name of a coat store actually, like the coat factory or something? I don't know. Okay. So coat's a use value, satisfies a particular need. A specific kind of productive activity is required to bring it into existence. Coat makers. This activity is determined by its aim, mode of operation, object, means, and result. Okay. So, yeah, this is almost like kind of quasi-Aristotelian or Hegelian. So we have an activity. And has an aim or goal, right? So I'm laboring to make a coat. A mode of operation. So this is Verrichtungsweise. So there's some procedure that I have to do this. An object, a Gegenstand. So this is the coat, presumably. Means, Mittel in German. So that would be your coat factory equipment. And result, which is the same as the aim, but in a different position, right? That would be the finished product. We use the abbreviated expression useful labor. I need to scroll this up. Let me see if I can condense this a little bit so I know when it ends. And I'm not gonna. Okay, so that way I'm not gonna be ahead of what's on the screen. All right. Useful labor for labor whose utility is represented by the use value of its product, or by the fact that its product is a use value. Okay, so useful labor, that's just labor that creates use values, things that someone can use to satisfy their needs or wants. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. All right, so this is the effect of the labor, presumably. As the coat and the linen are qualitatively different use values, right? So a coat satisfies a different need than a linen, so they are qualitatively different use values. So also are the forms of labor through which their existence is mediated, tailoring and weaving. Okay, so these are two different types of useful labor. Tailoring, from the perspective of society as a whole, does something useful for that society. It makes coats. Weaving does something else useful for that society. It makes linen, right? So these are two qualitatively different types of labor, of useful labor. If the use values were not qualitatively different, hence not the products of qualitatively different forms of useful labor, they would be absolutely incapable of confronting each other as commodities. So this is an interesting thing that Marx says, although it is kind of obvious. But what he's saying is that, like, if I have 10 wool, it can't really, like, there's not a like, it doesn't really make sense to trade 10 wool for 10 wool, right? That's a kind of nonsense trade, right? If I like said, like, here's $1, will you trade me $1 for this dollar, right? You'd be like, there's something up with that dollar, I don't trust it, that's probably fake, right? And so for use values to stand in an exchange value relationship with each other, there has to be they have to be different from each other in order to express themselves in each other. All right, so I have a question in the chat real quick. Oh, about the word here. Okay, let me see if I can blow up the chat a little bit. Okay. So I will look up the German word here. So it's gegenübertreten. So like gegenüber is like stand over, like to so treten is like to like, let me just look it up in the dictionary real quick so I can be more precise here of a translation. So to face, to confront, to rest, to approach, to confront. And treten is I think to step, yeah, to boot, to tread, to kick. And so I think like what we need to be thinking about here too, and there's going to be more about this I think later. I believe there's a footnote about Fichte, but if it's not in this chapter, it's in a different one. But think about Hegel's master-slave dialectic here, where the two self-conscious beings are looking at each other and confronting each other as different eyes, as different individual consciousnesses, and that it's on the basis of that difference that they recognize each other. That's the Hegelian perspective. And Marx says at one point that commodities are very much in the same relationship to each other as the master-slave dialectic, as the two eyes in Fichte or Hegel, because just like one can only be self-conscious or aware of oneself as an I by contrasting oneself with another I, right? That I'm only an I to myself insofar as I'm an I to someone else. Commodities can only express their value in terms of another commodity, as reflected into another commodity. And so that's what this idea of confrontation, that unless the commodities are different, they can't stand in that relationship of exchange value where they confront each other and express their value in one another. You can't do that with identical commodities. They have to be different commodities. And so, yeah, he spells it out here. Coats cannot be exchanged for coats, right? Now, right, you can exchange your coat at the store if something's wrong with it for like a better one, right? Or for a different color or something like that. But that proves the rule, right? That they have to be different from each other. One use value cannot be exchanged for another of the same kind, all right? You can see there is a dialectical component to this argument. Even though it seems very simple, there is this idea of things reflected into one another to express their value. Okay. Let's jump to the next paragraph. Good. Thank you for the question. Good question. Okay. The totality of heterogeneous use values or physical commodities reflects a totality of similarly heterogeneous forms of useful labor, which differ in order, genus, species, and variety. In short, a social division of labor. Okay. There's a bunch of different use values. All those different use values form a totality. And notice he says use values or physical commodities because the same thing. The use value is the material side of the commodity, whereas exchange value represents how it stands in relation to other commodities. It's not a physical part of the commodity. It's about its relationship in a social sense. Okay. Reflects a totality. Let's see if the German word's interesting there. That is an interesting German word. That is erscheinen, again. So that's the word for appear, which I am going to be publishing an article soon on the concept of appearance in Marx's Capital. And so this totality reflects, or is maybe an appearance of, a totality of similarly heterogeneous forms of useful labor. So all the different things we have represent all the different types of work that people have to do to make them. They differ in all these ways, and then this is what he calls social division of labor, right? So that's, where the division of labor is, I believe, where Adam Smith starts in The Wealth of Nations. And so Marx is introducing his concept of the division of labor here, right? There's all these different jobs that need to be done, all this different work, and all that different work is reflected into different commodities that are then bought and sold, which are products of that work. This division of labor is a necessary condition for commodity production. Although the converse does not hold, commodity production is not a necessary condition for the social division of labor. All right. Okay. So we can't produce commodities without some way of socially dividing labor amongst ourselves. However, we can divide labor amongst ourselves and not produce them as commodities. All right. So like you could have a different social arrangement that's not built upon producing things for markets, but is maybe producing things to be consumed directly, or things that there's a kind of like a communal society where everything made by the commune is distributed, right? Or it's each according to their ability, each according to their needs at a high stage communism. And so this would be an example of where there is a social division of labor, maybe a more advanced one, but it's not commodity production. But then here he says that commodity production cannot proceed without some form of social division of labor, right? So there can't be, everybody being a master of all in commodity production. That would seem to be an implication of this, maybe, right? Unless social division of labor is very broad and could include a social division of labor where people switch off their tasks constantly. Just limit case to kind of think about what the principles are here. Okay. Labor is socially divided in the primitive Indian community, although the products do not thereby become commodities. I'm not sure what historical example he's referring to here, and I'm not sure whether he's referring to people in India or to indigenous Americans, because Germans sometimes use that word, Indianer or something like that. I'm assuming is what it is in German. But, right, so here there's a social division, but no commodities, all right? Or to take an example nearer to home, labor is systematically divided in every factory, but the workers do not bring about this division by exchanging their individual products. Only the products of mutually independent acts of labor performed in isolation can confront each other as commodities. Okay, so here he's saying is like in a factory or workplace, just generally speaking, there is a division of labor, right? So a coffee shop, right? Somebody's working the register, someone's cleaning, someone's doing dishes in the back, someone is making the coffee, right? Making the lattes, making the espresso. And then, but all of those people aren't, the person at the cash register isn't like doing the register in exchange for some of the profits from the coffee maker, right? That's not what's going on here. Instead, this whole division of labor is about one product. In order for things to confront each other as commodities, they have to be mutually independent acts of labor formed in isolation. So one operation is producing a commodity, and then that independent system of labor or a workplace produces a commodity that then can confront a commodity somewhere else on the market. Okay. To sum up then, the use value of every commodity contains useful labor. That is, productive activity of a definite kind, carried on with a definite aim. Right? Okay. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor contained in them is qualitatively different in each case. Marx already said that. Or did he say that? Well, no, this would be an implication of his earlier claim that commodities have to be different use values to confront each other. But then this also means that the useful labor the commodities has to be different as well, right? So not only does a coat have to have a different use value than linen, but the value, the useful labor contained in the coat has to be different useful labor than linen. In a society whose products generally assume the form of commodities, that is, in a society of commodity producers, right, such as the capitalist mode of production, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor, which are carried on independently and privately by individual producers, develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. So, by virtue of the fact that we're doing commodity production and we're making these useful things on a market, and these useful things are confronting each other on this market and expressing their value in terms of one another, this itself gives rise to a complex system, a complex social division of labor, one which in many cases is carried on independently and privately by individual producers. Meaning, like, things pop up on a market that take on like a certain role within this complex social division of labor, and these different industries go on independently of each other, right, in a kind of free market capitalist setting, but they form a complex system when considered as a whole. It is moreover a matter of indifference whether the coat is worn by the tailor or his customer. In both cases, it acts as a use value. Okay? So too, the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it is not in itself altered when tailoring becomes a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. Men made clothes for thousands of years under the compulsion of the need for clothing, without a single man ever becoming a tailor. But the existence of coats, of linen, of every element of material wealth, not provided in advance by nature, had always to be mediated through a specific productive activity appropriate to its purpose, a productive activity that assimilated particular natural materials to particular human requirement. So, I'm going to get to the end and then I'm going to go back through this. Labor, then, as the creator of use values, as useful labor, is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature and therefore human life itself. Right? So much for saying that there are no eternal things in dialectical and historical materialism. But, okay. So as far as the use value goes, it doesn't matter who the consumer is. Okay, that's the point of this sentence. Because it's a use value for either of them. Right? Now, it's true that if the tailor wears the coat that they make themselves, it can't be an exchange value, but it can still be a use value. So too, the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it is not itself altered when tailoring becomes a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. So here he's saying that, like, you can still, like, making coats on a market, there's still this making coats relationship. It's a very, I don't know exactly what the point of this statement is. But he goes on to say that, like, there were years where people made clothing, they weren't yet tailors, they didn't yet have this profession where they were part of a particular branch of a social division of labor. And when there wasn't this social division of labor, when there wasn't this system where one could go and purchase the elements for making coats, some labor somewhere had to provide the natural materials for making those coats, right? So then this is where we get to this really important sentence. Labor, then, as the creator of use values, as useful labor, is a condition of human existence. So no matter what, human labor is required, like, until the fucking robots take over, right? And then that's still maybe some kind of labor. All human existence relies upon labor of some kind to make the use values that it needs. And this need for human labor is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal, natural necessity. Now, Marx did believe in evolution, so when he says eternal, he doesn't mean that human beings have always existed. I think that's very important. Does he even say eternal here? One second. Yep. Ewige Naturnotwendigkeit, which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. Now, throughout Capital, we're going to see that Marx talks a lot about metabolism. And if you know the work of John Bellamy Foster, you'll know that this is a huge concept for eco-Marxism and eco-socialism. But basically, so the word metabolism is Stoffwechsel, which is Stoff is like one of the words that it's like related to the word stuff in English, but it's like the word for matter, and Wechsel is to change, transform. So it's like transformation of matter, and so between human beings and nature, labor is constantly transforming matter and changing and moving it around, right, between the different human beings that need this stuff. And human life itself is mediated by this way that we metabolize nature, that we take the material from nature and change it and transform it. And that this is, the premise of historical materialism right here, that human beings have to work to keep themselves alive, that labor must transform nature into a form that allows us to continue our existence and to continue to meet our basic needs. And then, in the German ideology, Marx says that, the first thing we have to do is we have to labor to meet our basic needs, and after that, new needs. Right? Because we got some free time. Now we want to labor to enjoy our free time. But labor is the eternal condition of human existence. And unless, there's some very, very big advances in robotic technology, it's going to continue to be the eternal basis for human existence. And that's what's going on in this passage. And we're going to watch the term metabolism show up more. And Marx is here very influenced by biology, very influenced by cell theory, very influenced by this idea of these ideas going around with these cell theorists at the time, and these ideas of metabolism and the moving around of matter, the moving around of the cells in the body. Well, let's continue to the next paragraph. Use values like coats, linen, etc. In short, the physical bodies of commodities. So here again, Marx is equating use values with the physical bodies of commodities, with the material things. Hold on a second. Wanted to see. Lost my place though. Yeah, so Warenkörper is German here. So Körper is like body, where we, related to the word corporeal. So it's the commodity body. That's literally what it is. So use values like coats, linen, etc. In short, the physical bodies of commodities, the commodity body, are combinations of two elements: the material provided by nature and labor. Okay? So I wonder where my glasses were, actually. I was looking for them last night. These glasses, product of human labor. That's one element. The other element is like the glass, right? At some point came from like sand or something like that. The plastic from, whatever chemicals go into plastic, right? So those are the two elements: labor, nature. If we subtract the total amount of useful labor of different kinds which is contained in the coat, the linen, etc., a material substratum is always left. And so, Yeah, materialis substrat. So quite literally, material substratum. So this would be if we were to take away everything that human beings have done to alter something, to create it, to produce it. There's always, this came out of the ground somewhere, right? That's the idea. This substratum is furnished by nature without human intervention, right? So now we're looking at some of how Marx conceptualized nature. That nature itself brings about certain things organically without human beings needing to interfere in labor. When man engages in production, he can only proceed as nature does herself, i.e., he can only change the form of the materials. Going to look this up. So, nur die Formen der Stoffe ändern. So, quite literally, can only change the materials. And so here we have more materialism, right? So the idea of there being matter, and then what nature does is change the form of that matter, right? You remember Marx wrote his dissertation on Epicurean atomism. He wrote it on Greek atomists and pre-Socratics who were thinking about, Thales said everything's made of water, and so he understood everything as water being the matter that's constantly reshaping itself. Similarly, the atomists, everything's made of atoms, but the atoms are constantly reconfiguring themselves. So so there is a material substratum, right? Like there is like these basically the atoms here, right? And nature, through different natural processes, at some point configured the atoms in a certain way to make the material that's then extracted by human labor and turned into glass, right? And in both cases, I think I have a better example than glass, but let's think of something like like ice or something like that, right? Like a lake freezes in the winter. That's a natural process that changes the form of that water to something solid. Then you have to go out and cut a block of that ice, like people used to do back in the old day, right? Just like nature changes, by nature, the water into ice through a natural process of freezing. The human being through the labor cuts that block out and changes the form of that block into a square or a cube. So then let's see what this footnote is. Okay. So the footnote is quoting Pietro Verri. It looks like Meditations on Political Economy. And I don't know this author, but the author says all the phenomena of the universe, whether produced by the hand of man or indeed the universal laws of physics, are not to be conceived of as acts of creation, but solely as a reordering of matter. Composition and separation are the only elements found by the human mind whenever it analyzes the notion of reproduction. And so it is with the reproduction of value. Use value, although Verri himself, in this polemic against the physiocrats, is not quite certain of the kind of value he's referring to. And wealth, whether earth, air, and water are turned into corn in the fields, or the secretions of an insect are turned into silk by the hands of man, or some small pieces of metal are arranged together to form a repeating watch. So that's where he's getting this idea is from these physiocrats. And I know the philosophy side of things than the political economy side of things, but I would love to investigate all these sources at one point myself. So, let me know in the comments if you know more about the physiocrats and where this comes from. But we can see that there is materialism here, right? This idea of there is matter and the matter reshaping itself into other forms. Furthermore, even in this work of modification, he is constantly helped by natural forces. Labor is therefore not the only source of material wealth, that is, of the use values it produces. As William Petty says, labor is the father of material wealth, the earth is its mother, and I'm sure that someone has some either Freudian or feminist analysis of this quote from A Treatise of Taxes and Contributions. And so things in nature can be useful. Marx already said that in the previous section. And what makes something useful is that it has the right form, the matter is in the right configuration, and matter can be put into that configuration by natural forces, by human labor, or by human labor working alongside natural forces, right? The laws of physics and physical forces aid us in our labor, right? At all times. And really, like, if you are going to be very dialectical about it, there is you can't maintain a rigid distinction between human beings and nature in Marx. I remember once watching a documentary on Buddhists who were in a monastery, and there's some white dude who's like a hippie who's like talking to them, and he's like, "Do you feel like closer to like meditation when you're like in nature?" And the Buddhist is like, "What do you mean nature? Like I'm nature, you're nature. The rock over there is nature. That cup on the table is nature. Everything's nature. Nothing is nature, right?" So in a way that where natural the play of natural forces, right? Like swinging a hammer, you're reshaping something, but you're still using gravity to help you with that, right? So where nature and artifice, with the line between them, is always going to be fuzzy, and so we're thinking about these terms dialectically. We're not saying here's nature over here, here's human beings and natural artifice over here, but these are ultimately intertwined things. Okay. Now let us pass from the commodity as an object of utility, that is, as a use value, to the value of commodities. Now remember, value here is the socially necessary labor time in the commodities, which is expressed in exchange value, but those are different things. Okay. We have assumed that the coat is worth twice as much as the linen, right? That was our example. One coat is, what, 20 linen, I think was the example. But this is merely a quantitative difference and does not concern us at the moment. We shall therefore simply bear in mind that if the value of a coat is twice that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen will have the same value as a coat, right? Math. As values, the coat and the linen have the same substance. They are objective expressions of homogeneous labor. Let's see if there's something interesting going on here in the German. So objektive Ausdrücke. So quite literally, Ausdrücke is like expressions from like drucken to press. So like Ausdrücke is like to press out. Expression too, as in like speech. Like that's an expression to, like okay, so as values, the code and the limit will have the same substance, but they are the objective expressions of homogeneous labor. I wanted to look up substance too. Oh, just substance. Same word. So labor, homogeneous labor, so and abstract labor, just labor, socially necessary labor in the abstract without regard to the kind of labor. That is what's objectively, that's the substance of value. Value is the objective expression of abstract labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different forms of labor, right? Different jobs. There are, however, states of society in which the same man alternatively makes clothes and weaves, right? So you can imagine somebody doing the whole process themselves. First they weave, then they make the coat. In this case, these two different modes of labor are only modifications of the labor of the same individual and not yet fixed functions peculiar to different individuals, just as the coat our tailor makes today and the pair of trousers he makes tomorrow require him to only vary his own individual labor. So one person does this. There are two different types of labor, but just one individual who does one thing and then does another thing. Similarly to the tailor who's like, I got to make a coat today, I got to make pants tomorrow. Moreover, we can see at a glance that in our capitalist society, a given portion of labor is supplied alternatively in the form of tailoring and in the form of weaving, in accordance with the changes in the direction of the demand for labor. This change in the form of labor may well not take place without friction, but it must take place. So what he's saying is at the macro level in capitalist society, just like the one guy is like weaving first and then making the coat later, that from like the macro perspective, there is some labor that's given the weaving and some that's giving the tailoring, and that there is this similar back and forth between forms of labor happening in the society, just like the one labor can vary their form, right? And this has to do with demand, right? So demand is a factor here, and yeah, the change in the form of labor may well not take place without friction, but it must take place. I'm not sure exactly what he means by this here, but I think this would be something along the lines of like, there can be there has to be there can be like hiccups in the market, what basically, right? But there has to be somebody doing, if somebody's going to be there's like, think of a supply chain or something like that, because that's what we're talking about here, right? Like the weaving has to be done before the tailoring, and the labor for it to continue down the supply chain, these changes have to occur in human labor at the higher level, um, for this process to continue until the code is made. If we leave aside the determinate quality of productive activity, and therefore the useful character of the labor, what remains is its quality of being an expenditure of human labor power. Now, this is somewhat redundant to some of the stuff we talked about in the last time. Let's see where we are. I think they added, it's going to be too hard to look through all of this to see what's going on in the German here. But yes, right, leave aside the use values. What you have is that everything is a expenditure of human labor, right? Weavers are working, tailors are working. Tailoring and weaving, although they are qualitatively different productive activities, are both a productive expenditure. So they're productive, like doing something, making a use value. Expenditure, something's being consumed. So there's a production and a consumption of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc. And in this sense, both human labor. Oh, both tailoring and weaving. Right? So when you work, you're producing, but you're also using up your brain, right? You're using your muscles, your nerves, you're taking energy from yourself. They are merely two different forms of the expenditure of human labor power. So the human body is doing something, and the form of that changes, yet it's still doing something in both cases. Of course, human labor power must itself have attained a certain level of development before it can be expended in this or that form. Right? You have to be able to do that kind of labor. But the value of a commodity represents human labor pure and simple, the expenditure of human labor in general. All right, so you see here's the move, the real abstraction. The value, what things are worth, is not they're worth a particular kind of labor. They're worth labor in general, abstract labor. That somebody had to use their brains and muscles and time and energy to do this thing. Someone somewhere for a certain amount of time. And just as in civil society, a general or a baker plays a great part, but man as such plays a very mean part, there is a reference to Hegel's philosophy right here. I would have to go look it up. Sorry I didn't prepare that, but I'll do that in the bonus episode. Right, so like the general has a role to play, baker has a role to play, but what about human beings in general? Right? What's the role of the human being in society compared to the baker or the general, right? So here too, the same is true of human labor. It is the expenditure of simple labor power that is, of the labor power possessed in his bodily organism by every ordinary man, on the average, without being developed in any special way. So, labor in general, simple labor. The labor power possessed in the bodily organism by every ordinary person, just on average. Okay. Simple average labor. So simple meaning not complex, not skilled. Average meaning we take all of the labor in society and then we find what the average person does, the average worker and labor, right? It is true, varies in character in different countries and at different cultural epochs, but in a particular society, it is given. Right? So the average labor might change in different points in history. The simple average labor labor might change in different countries too. But for a given society, there is a simple average labor. More complex labor counts only as intensified, or rather multiplied simple labor, so that a smaller quantity of complex labor is considered equal to a larger quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. Okay. Now, I remember in Harvey's course on capital that he doesn't really give a satisfying answer to what's going on here, from what I remember. But I want to elaborate this from a Marxist perspective because I think it can be kind of confusing because you need to go to a higher level of analysis to really make sense of this. Okay. So what he's saying here is that more complex labor, that is like labor that's skilled, that takes some attention, that takes a lot more effort and training and things like this, is intensified or multiplied. Meaning that, like, when he says a smaller quantity of complex labor is equal to a larger quantity of simple labor, a simple way to put this in terms that are more familiar is that if you have highly skilled complex labor, you can make more money doing it than from doing simple labor. Right? So a doctor working for an hour makes more money in our society. Now, I'm using money here, even though we haven't introduced it, just to illustrate it quickly. But in the terms we have so far, makes more value during that hour than a Amazon shipping worker does in 12 hours. Like in terms of just what their labor power adds, because the doctor is adding more complex, more skilled labor. So then the question is what makes the value of one labor higher than the other? And that's, in Marxist understanding, is that it's harder to reproduce that type of labor. That labor is ultimately a product of society, and a doctor has to go do way more studying. So that labor is harder to reproduce, so it's more expensive, and we do pay those people more, right? Unless you're an academic like me teaching as an adjunct professor, in which case my labor is very hard to reproduce, and yet somehow it's not valued. But generally speaking, we do see labor that's harder to obtain as having a higher, as having more value to producing more value. And experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. We're constantly, paying people more who are more skilled. A commodity may be the outcome of the most complicated labor, but through its value, it is posited as equal to the product of simple labor. Hence, it represents only a specific quantity of simple labor, right? Because ultimately, if something that I make through complex labor goes onto a market and expresses its value, then we can find out exactly how much simple labor is represented in that that complex labor, right? So if I have an American-made Fender Stratocaster, like I do have behind me, and I compare that to a Squier made in a Fender Squier Stratocaster made in a sweatshop, that American-made guitar is probably going to be 5 times the price. Now, some of that has to do with the wages, some of that has to do with the cost of labor and things like that, but also some of that has to do with the fact that there's more complex, more skillful labor put into the making of an American guitar than there is into a guitar that's made on an assembly line in a factory, right? And so that's expressed in the commodities. But since we can reduce them to each other, we can ultimately express complex labor in terms of simplified labor, since they're exchangeable with one another. The various proportions in which different kinds of labor are reduced to a simple labor as their unit of measurement are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers. These proportions therefore appear to be to the producers to have been handed down from tradition. That's really interesting. I think I've explored this with my students before too. So it seems like we just pay doctors more, for example, because that's what you do. And so it seems like it's handed down by tradition, or like how much you pay people for certain things. But Marx is saying that that's the appearance. And I wonder if that's air shining or shine. Shining. So appear here as false appearance, as seeming. So it seems to be handed down by tradition that we pay doctors more than um, simple laborers. But in fact, there are proportions established between these different types of labor, ultimately through the cost of reproducing that type of labor. That's the social process. And the social process goes on behind the backs of the producers. They don't even notice it. And then they have this mythology, this ideology that says, oh, it's a tradition that establishes what different types of labor are worth. It's tradition that says you pay the person who's has more training, more education, more, and you pay the person who doesn't less, right? So that'd be an ideological thing. It'd be an explanation, a false explanation of what's going on. In the interest of simplification, we shall henceforth view every form of labor power directly as simple labor power. By this, we shall simply be saving ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. Okay, so he's going to be talking only about simple labor, but that doesn't mean what he's saying doesn't hold for more complex forms of labor. This is just because they're reducible to each other, he's going to focus on just, okay, you're working a minimum wage job, doing simple tasks without very much training or education. Just as in viewing the coat and linen as values, we abstract from their different use values. So, in the case of the labor represented by those values, do we disregard the difference between its useful forms, tailoring and weaving? Right? So we abstract from the different use values, but we also abstract from whether it's tailoring or weaving when we just say, what's the value? Right? What's the socially necessary labor time expressed in these things? The use values, coat and linen, are combinations of, on the one hand, productive activity with a definite purpose, and on the other, cloth and yarn. All right, so then the productive activity, that's the so-called father of the values, right? Like the labor, and then the cloth and yarn, that's the so-called mother of the values. But I guess that would actually be like, the product of some other forms of labor. That's the raw materials that the person's laboring on. The values coat and linen, however, are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous labor. In the same way, the labor contained in these values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being an expenditure of human labor power. So it doesn't have to do with what you're working on, but just that you've expended labor power in a useful way. Tailor and weaving are the formative elements in the use values coat and linen, precisely because these two types of labor are different quantities or qualities, but only insofar as abstraction is made from their particular qualities, only insofar as both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the two articles mentioned. So tailoring and weaving, as labors, form the substance of value, Not insofar as they're particular forms of labor. That's only insofar as they form use values, but only insofar as we abstract from what particular things they're doing and just say there was some labor done here. And I feel like Marx has said this several times already. Coats and linen, however, are not merely values in general, but values of a definite magnitude. And following our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Why is there this difference in value? Because the linen only contains only half as much labor as the coat. Right? So if the coat's worth twice as much labor. So that labor power had to be expended twice as long, right? So takes twice the time to make the coat, quite literally, to produce the second as to produce the first. So if the coat is worth twice as much as 10 yards of linen, then it takes twice as long to make a coat as it does to make 10 yards of linen. Now, when we say worth here and we say value here, remember this is a dialectical argument. This is a dialectical method. So we're building up layers here, right? Now, it might not be that if we go actually look on a market right now, that 10 yards of linen, on fucking Amazon or whatever, I misspelled Lenin. How about that? 10 yards of Lenin is $32, right? And then I don't know how much a coat is, right? Like a coat is $60. How about that? All right, so yeah, all right, there we go. But right, it might not be exact, but because there might be other factors going on. But we're working at a very simple level, so we can build up things like supply and demand or different processes going on in the production process. Okay. While therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value it counts only quantitatively, once it has been reduced to human labor pure and simple. So just how much labor pure and simple, that's how much value. What's it useful for? What kind of labor went into it? In the former case, it was a matter of the how and the what of labor. In the latter, of the how much of the temporal duration of labor. So how was it made? What was made? Versus how much time was put into it. Since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents nothing but the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. Right? So a certain amount of anything on a market is going to be worth a certain amount of something else for any other commodity. Right? Like if these glasses, I mean, they're kind of like, used already, broken, but you go to the store to buy a pair of glasses, those are going to have the value that's the same as a certain amount of any other commodity. That's the argument here. If the productivity of all the different sorts of useful labor required, let's say, for the production of a coat remains unchanged, so productivity here is like commodity per hour, like how fast is it at making things? The total value of the coats produced will increase along with their quantity. So the more coats you have, the more money you have. If productivity is not going up or declining. If one coat represents X days labor, two coats represents 2X days labor, and so on. But now assume that the duration of the labor necessary for the production of a coat is doubled or halved. In the first coat, one coat is worth as much as two coats were before. In the second case, two coats are worth only as much as one was before, although in both cases, one coat performs the same service. The useful labor contained in it remains the same quantity. Okay, so a machine is developed that lets us develop quotes twice as fast. The quotes were 60 bucks on Amazon. Now they're 30 bucks on Amazon, right? Or let's say that there's like a fucking like moth infestation, and half of the coats are like damaged or something, or I don't know, like people are hunting for moths, so there's twice as much labor. Well, now quotes have doubled. Now they're $120 on Amazon. One change has taken place, however, a change in the quantity of labor expended to produce the article, right? So that's ultimately what changes things. How productive is your labor? How many coats are you making per hour? That's how much they're going to cost, or that's how much value they're going to have, because cost is ultimately a kind of higher level of analysis. In itself, an increase in the quantity of use values constitutes an increase in material wealth. Right? Okay, so we said at the beginning, material wealth, that's the number of use values. More use values means more wealth. Two coats will clothe two men. One coat will only clothe one man, right? So the more coats, the more people are warm. Nevertheless, an increase in the amount of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. That's hinting at the contradiction of capitalism already. The wealthier you are, the less value you have. This contradictory movement, contradiction, right, arises out of the twofold character of labor. So there is a contradiction in the commodity, and this arises from the fact that labor is both specific and general. And because of this twofold character of labor, there's a contradiction whereby the more wealth you have, the less value you have. The more wealth you can produce, the less valuable that wealth is. That's the contradiction. By productivity, of course, we always mean the productivity of concrete useful labor. In reality, this determines only the degree of effectiveness of a productive activity directed towards a given purpose within a period of time. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products in direct proportion as its productivity rises or falls. Right? So the more you can make, the more the more stuff you have, right? Like, okay, so as against this, however, variations in productivity have no impact whatever on the labor itself represented in value. As productivity is an attribute of labor in its concrete useful form, it naturally ceases to have any bearing on that labor as soon as we abstract from its concrete useful form. The same labor, therefore, performed for the same length of time, always yields the same amount of value independently of any variations in productivity. But it provides different quantities of use values during equal periods of time, more if productivity rises, fewer if it falls. For this reason, the same change in productivity, which increases the fruitfulness of labor, and therefore the amount of use values produced by it, also brings about a reduction in the value of this increased total amount if it cuts down the total amount of labor time necessary to produce the use values. The converse also holds. So this is saying generally what we just talked about, right? The more you can make, the quicker you can make a lot of things, the less that is all worth. When productivity rises, stuff gets cheaper. On the other hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, and it is in this quality of being equal or abstract human labor that it forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in a particular form with a definite aim, and it is in this quality of being concrete useful labor that it produces use values. So the use value distinction corresponds to a distinction within labor between the real abstraction of labor power in general, or labor in general, and the use value and the concrete useful labor that produces the use values. And here we have a note with Adam Smith. In order to prove that labor alone is the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared, Adam Smith says this: equal quantities of labor at all times and all places must have the same value for the laborer. In his ordinary state of health, strength, and activity, in the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his liberty, and his happiness. On the one hand, Adam Smith here, but not everywhere, confuses his determination of value by the quantity of labor expended in the production of commodities with the determination of the values of commodities by the value of labor. Therefore, endeavors to prove that equal quantities of labor always have the same value. On the other hand, he has the suspicion that insofar as labor manifests itself in the form of the commodities, it only counts as an expenditure of labor power. But then again, he views this expenditure merely as a sacrifice of rest, freedom, and happiness, not as man's normal life activity. Of course, he has the modern wage labor in mind. Adam Smith's anonymous predecessor, cited in Note 9, is much nearer to the mark when he says one man has employed himself a week providing this necessary of life, and he that gives him some other in exchange cannot make a better estimate of what is a proper equivalent than by computing what cost him just as much labor and time, which in effect is no more than exchanging one man's labor in one thing for another, for a time certain, for another man's labor in another thing for some time. The English language has the advantage of possessing two separate words for these two different aspects of labor. Labor, which creates use values and is qualitatively determined, is called work as opposed to labor. Labor, which creates value and is only measured quantitatively, is called labor as opposed to work. So there's a lot going on there, and I'm not going to go into all of it because we're already getting over time. But that is interesting that work in English expresses this what Marx calls specific concrete labor, and labor is expresses general abstract labor. Oh, that's it. We have the value form as the next chapter. Let's go back and look at this real quick. So useful labor becomes therefore a more or less abundant source of products in direct proportion as its productivity rises or falls. So I'm doing something useful, and my productivity goes up. More products, my productivity goes down, less products. Against this, however, variations in productivity have no impact whatsoever on the labor itself represented in value. I think he's talking here about like my productivity can go up or down, but what I specifically do isn't what matters because it's the social average that determines, and the labor in the abstract that determines the value in there. As productivity is an attribute of labor in its concrete useful form, so productivity has to do with what I'm actually doing, laboring. It naturally ceases to have any bearing on that labor as soon as we abstract from its concrete useful form. Okay, so this is to explain the fact that increases in material wealth, that's like I'm doing something in a specific task and I'm being productive, that I'm making a lot of shit. So that specific task and like what I'm physically making at my job, whatever, like that's productivity is part of that concrete labor. But that concrete labor, insofar as its value, it produces value, is also abstract. And as abstract labor, it's falling because I'm working and I'm producing a lot of things. I'm producing a lot of material wealth in my specific concrete role, right? Like, I don't know, maybe I'm making watches. I'm making 5 watches an hour somehow by some miracle, right? Um, but, and those I'm making, like, specifically, here's a lot of material wealth, I'm making a lot of stuff. But what I'm doing in that concrete activity, as in my work, right? the labor time, the value is falling because of how productive I'm being. So the more you make, the more commodities you make per hour, the less they're all worth. Because what's going on really in my working is I'm producing more material wealth. But as abstract, what's abstract is just how much labor time has been expended. And so the more I'm making in terms of commodities, the faster I'm producing them, the more commodities per hour. And so value, which has to do with just how long did I work, regardless of what I was doing, falls or is distributed among a wider spread of commodities. So that's how we locate, to go back to the top topic of this thing. And there's some people whose entire reading of Capital revolves around this dual character of labor. Labor is your specific work, what you do to produce value, what commodities you make. Or, if you're in service industry, then you're adding your labor time still to the product, just in a way that you're not. It's not commodities per hour, but how many commodities are you selling per hour, right? How much are you moving? But that specific job, that specific work, versus the labor time, which is abstract, which is the abstract form that gives is the value bearing substance. That's the basic contradiction here. And that basic contradiction is how we can look and think about things like the more we make, the less we make, right? These contradictions, where increasing our productivity when it comes to producing commodities makes all of these things worth a lot less. So next time, we're going to do the value form or exchange value next Tuesday at 7 p.m. I'll be releasing Patreon episodes on these topics at some point, and we'll go through that Hegel reference there, and we'll go through this Adam Smith quote. I hope this was fun for everyone. Hope everyone found the conversation and pleasant, and the commentary helpful in some way. Please, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment if you have a question, or if there's something you'd like me to respond to or answer, and I'll do that. But otherwise, have a good night, and I will see you all next Tuesday at 7 p.m.